Hey everybody! I'm not too far from the treehouse right now, but it's hard to explain how much life has sprung into action in just the last 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago there was snow on the ground, and now all the leaves are unfurling on the trees and the flowers are blooming everywhere. But one creature that I'm going to mention now, and I don't want to mention again, is something that's a starring attraction of every clip that I make in this video: black flies. They're biting us, they're swarming us, you'll see them in many shots, and those creatures do like to suck our blood. There are many different species, but there's a good thing about black flies. They start their lives underwater, and the fact that we have them is a sign that we have clean water. Any pollution kills black fly larvae, so consider that a small price to pay for living in a place with really clean fresh water. And speaking of fresh water, in addition to looking for blooming flowers and amphibians like toads and frogs, we're gonna go on a chase for beavers. I hope to find some live beavers. I've been to 3 sites. I've gotten at least 5 ticks biting me, but I've not been able to get any shots of living beavers. But I did find a place where they've been busy very recently. I maybe missed them by minutes. So follow me as we go out into the wilderness and look at all the things that are coming alive now. And of course, you don't have to live in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont to enjoy the species featured in this video, because many of them are seen in other parts of the northeastern United States and in Canada. So get outside, but maybe bring some bug spray. We have many snakes that live in Vermont, but the one you're most likely to find in your backyard is definitely the eastern garter snake. This snake lives in many habitats in many parts of our country, and it's not really dangerous, but like all snakes, it likes to taste the air with its tongue. All winter they have to find a place underground deep enough where they won't freeze, so that they don't turn into snakesicles. So snakes have to find a hole because they can't dig. And this snake, I think, has found a nice home in the retaining wall by my house, where our heated basement keeps him from freezing all winter long. They're definitely not poisonous, but if you mess with them, they'll spray a combination of bodily fluids and scat at you, so watch out. Last year, the community around Harvey's Lake in the town of Barnet was faced with a challenge. The beavers had decided to build a dam and raise the level of the lake without getting a permit or consulting with the Lake Harvey Association. And the town had to do something before properties were threatened. Many people live around Harvey's Lake, and the Stevens River is the only outlet of water from that lake. So if the beavers make a dam here, they will raise the water and flood many homes. It looks like someone came back, some beaver, and tried to repair part of the broken dam, and they even used human building materials. Could this be a message from the beaver? Or maybe some kind of revenge? I was hoping to see live beavers, but instead I just got to see lots of flowers like these marsh marigolds that grow in wet places, even in ditches on the side of the road. Maybe that's why Vermonters often call them cowslips. Watch closely or you'll miss it. This is the ruby-throated hummingbird, the smallest bird that visits Vermont, and it's also a pollinator too. These birds migrate from as far away as Panama, Mexico, or Florida to come and raise their young here in the Green Mountains. This is the only hummingbird that we get to see here in Vermont. And like all hummingbirds, its diet is mostly the nectar from flowers, which means a lot of sugar. And sometimes the little bits of insects that fall into those flowers give them some nutrients and protein too. It's crazy to imagine that this creature evolved from the dinosaurs. And if you ever see them fighting over the rights to feed at a feeder, this is a male. You can see his red throat that marks him as a male. They will defend their territory, and it'll seem like you're in an X-Wing TIE Fighter dogfight from Star Wars. So duck. Well, nothing says the month of May like dandelions. And I'm out here in the middle of a big hayfield. This field, mowed by the local dairy farmers, the Pearl family, it only gets mowed about 3 times a year, but that makes sure that there's nothing but grass and flowers like dandelions growing here. And Boy, dandelions are such a welcome sight, especially this year when it was snowing only 2 weeks ago. And if you're wondering why they're so abundant, why dandelions are so universally everywhere, they're not even native to North America. They came here with European immigrants and became part of our ecosystem. Perhaps they're an invasive species, but it's definitely too late to stop this invasion. And part of the reason is because dandelions' best friends are kids. Any kid who likes to find these is responsible for spreading dandelions. These yellow flowers will turn into this big puffball of seeds, and each seed has its own little paragliding parachute. There's a seed, and it's thanks to all the kids in the world that dandelions are everywhere, and maybe some adults. Many of you may be wondering why we call them dandelions. Is it because they're fashionable big cats? No, it actually comes from their French name, and it has to do with the shape of their leaves. You see, long before the flowers come out, you may have noticed these leaves on the lawn, and these are dandelion leaves, and that comes from the French word dent de lion, which means teeth of the lion, like dent, like dentist, and lion. So look at these little green leaves and imagine them as being lion's teeth, and then you see why we call them dent de lion or dandelion. How many flying insects will you be able to count on this screen? All of them are pollinators, and they're not just bees. Some might be gnats, some might be flies, wasps, even mosquitoes can be pollinators too. 1/3 of all the food that we eat comes from fruits that were pollinated by insects like these. And the Vermont Center for Eco-Studies has recently published a report saying that there are more than 320 species of bees native to Vermont, but there's one that you can easily identify on sight. The orange-belted bumblebee, Bombus ternarius. Also known as the tricolor bee, this bee is big and loud, and you will see it on the dandelions and all the other flowers that are blooming now. I wonder if it knows karate. That's strange. When I planted that black walnut tree, it didn't have any flowers on it. What is this? It's not a flower, but something that wants to eat pollinators. The goldenrod crab spider, perfectly disguised. Its yellow color helps it blend in with many flowers blooming now, but it can also switch to white, which means it can blend into many more flowers and eat many more pollinators. After hearing a report of a beaver sighting near the Cross Vermont Trail in Wells River, I came to check it out, and I was impressed by the amazing amount of stuff they had built here. What they've created is a sort of multi-level, multi-terraced habitat here, and they tend to do that. Beavers move along a watershed as they find more and more trees that they like to eat. And what's cool about this spot is that we're in the town of Wells River, Vermont. We're right next door to Groton, Vermont. And Groton, Vermont is where beavers were reintroduced to Vermont back in the 1930s. Yes, our biggest rodent and this keystone species that builds so much habitat for others, like the frogs that you hear, they were wiped out completely during the days of the fur trade back in the 1700s and 1800s. Beavers almost went extinct because of people wanting to make hats with them. But luckily, someone who lived in Groton, Mr. Noyes at Sion Ranch, decided to have some beavers brought to him, a male and a female, in the 1930s, and when he put them in his pond, they reproduced, and now Vermont has beavers everywhere. Although I didn't find any live beavers, I felt like I was in a ghost town. The beavers had built so much here, I wondered how many years and how many generations of beavers did it take to build this entire sequence of dams and ponds. The place was so big, I felt like I was in an abandoned village. Now I'm in the fourth of a series of consecutive beaver ponds that step down this watershed, but still no sign of active beavers. I know that they've been here, but I don't think they've been here for a while. This was definitely the entrance to a lodge, but in order for beavers to feel safe, this entrance would have had to have been underwater. And this tells you that the pond level has dropped. All that's living here now, seemingly, are these whirligig beetles swimming around. One of the frogs that we can hear now is the gray tree frog. It's hard to tell it apart from all the other frogs, but it's not the peepers that we've heard. And they're calling from high up in the trees instead of down in the water. But the gray tree frog, like the wood frog that we saw in one of my previous videos, and the spring peepers, are one of the 3 frogs that can be frozen during the winter and they come back to life almost like out of a science fiction movie. But gray tree frogs also are capable of changing the color of their skin for camouflage, so you may not be able to see them easily, but you can always hear them from far away.
On our way back home from the Wells River Beaver site, we heard the wind in the willows and we saw Mr. Toad. He was on his way to the water to have his annual mating ritual, and we also saw a young toad who was probably having his first spring fully out of the water. I'm sure you heard the rhyme about violets being blue, but this is one of our most common violets, and scientists have found that those stripes help guide pollinators into the flower like the lights on a runway at the airport.
Of all the spring ephemerals that dominate the forest at this time of year, the bluets have to win. They're like the dandelions are in the meadow. Here in the understory are the bluets, also known as innocents. And you might notice that their petals are different colors. Some of them are pretty pale white and some of them are bluish colored, and that might depend on how much acidity or what other nutrients are present in that spot where they're growing. So in a kind of cool way, their variations tell you something about the chemistry of the soil in the forest. There are so many ferns coming up at this time of year in that familiar fiddlehead fashion, but this is one that is an evergreen fern. It's called Christmas fern. Here are new sprouts for this year, but down here on the ground you can see the ones from last year haven't really died, and that's why it's called Christmas fern. I think people could gather it in the winter and use it as a decoration to make wreaths and garlands because it would still be green and not too hard to find in December. But thanks to an old friend of the museum, Ruth Crane, who used to run our flower table, she told me that the reason why they're called Christmas ferns, or at least how she remembered, is that each little leaf looks like a tiny little Christmas stocking. Here's a fern that's distinctive in the way it grows. It's called bracken, and it has a long stem before any leaves appear, and the leaves always kind of spread out in a flat fashion. So when I see bracken in the woods, it reminds me of old-fashioned rooftop television antennas, spread out with their leaves almost all at the same level and their stems very long and leaves far from the ground. It's different from all the other ferns that we have here. Well, here are the ferns that people like to eat when they're tightly wrapped up in their fiddleheads. These got away from me. I didn't get a chance to eat them, but now they're unfurling to become ostrich ferns, which are one of the many ferns that grow here. But the reason why they're called ostrich ferns is not because ostriches from Africa come to eat them, but because they kind of resemble the long tail feathers of an ostrich, and when they get very fully grown, they're very tall and they're really elegant blowing in the wind. But of all the ferns that make fiddleheads, these are the ones that you want to eat. The other ones, a lot of them don't taste very good. Here's a fern that's called sensitive fern, not because it gets its feelings hurt, but because this one, unlike the Christmas fern that survives green all winter, this one dies as soon as there's even the tiniest touch of frost in the fall. So it's a very delicate plant, And before it became this, its life started out in one of these. This is the part of a fern that makes spores. Some ferns have them on the undersides of their leaves. Some of them have them on a separate structure like this. And when you shake these, little pieces come out, and those little tiny pieces of dust are potentially baby ferns. These will have to find a wet place. That's why you see ferns growing in moist land and not in dry deserts. They need to land in water, and if they do, they'll be able to move around and swim, and they'll even mate. And then, after they've mated, they'll make a new fern, which will make more spores, and the life cycle starts over again. But ferns are an ancient kind of plant, much older than flowering plants, and their life cycle has a part that resembles that of animals. Just a quick update on the coltsfoot flowers that we talked about in a previous video. They're no longer yellow. Now they've turned into big tufts of seeds. And this only adds to the confusion why people mix them up for dandelions, because their seeds do resemble dandelion seeds, although they have a different shaped parachute, and they do also like to blow away in the wind. But the coltsfoot flowers have finished making seeds, but the coltsfoot leaves are now just emerging. So after the flowers are gone, you're going to see these leaves for the rest of the summer. You won't have to go far to find this spring flower, gill over the ground, or ground ivy. And its little flowers are going to be blooming even on your lawn, because the lawnmower blade might miss them and you can see them. There'll also be a weed in your garden, but thanks to Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, I've started calling this gillyweed instead of gill over the ground. But no, kids, eating this will not give you the ability to swim and breathe underwater. Don't miss the little wild strawberries hiding amongst the grass at the edge of fields and in the forest where there's a lot of sunshine. These wild strawberries might even grow on your lawn. And the white flower that you see now, well, that cone in the center, the bright yellow part, that's the pistils that will make the seeds, which means when you eat the strawberry that grows a couple weeks from now, you'll be eating the center part of this flower. But you'll be lucky to find any of these wild strawberries when they're ripe. As soon as they get red and juicy and sweet, they're very small compared to the commercially grown strawberries, but all the animals in the woods love to eat them, and you'll be lucky if you ever find them before the critters do. But you may be mowing them down on your lawn, even without noticing, so check them out. 3 leaves and a white flower right now. Now just imagine these little plants towering hundreds of feet high over our heads, and that would have been the world 350 million years ago or so, during the Carboniferous period, when trees like these horsetails used to dominate the earth. Well, if you burn coal, that fossil fuel contains a lot of the wood from what used to be the giant horsetails, and today they have to stay about a foot tall. This is field horsetail, a plant that no longer grows to tree sizes like it used to, but a plant with a very interesting life cycle. It's either going to have big green leaves, or it's going to make spores. So it alternates from one version to another. And when it is making spores, it lacks all of these frilly leaf structures. So sometimes people see just a slender stalk and they call it snake grass. And there are other species, but this is the field horsetail. We have bigger ones too that grow in the woods, sometimes known as scouring rushes. Even though this was a cold spring, we're nearing the end of May, and you can see that the leaves on these maples and other hardwood trees like birches and beeches growing behind me are already almost fully deployed, which means it's getting shady down here on the forest floor, and those spring ephemerals are having to rush through their seed process because they're not going to get any more sunshine once those leaves are fully unfurled. If you remember the beech trees from the first video, the ones that held on to their golden leaves from last year, well, they don't need to hold on to their old leaves because they've got new bright green ones for this summer. Remember the sugar maples from my first video? Look at what their leaves look like now. No longer just little tiny buds. And these leaves are not full sized yet. They're still going to get bigger and they're going to get greener. In fact, you can see a little bit of the tint and a hint of the color that they might show us in the fall when these leaves are getting ready to drop to the ground. If you remember the striped maples, here they are, and now their leaves are out. Their leaves are really big. Sometimes they get as big as a dinner plate, and they have a name. Some old Vermonters call them the goosefoot maple because of this distinctive leaf shape. But I'll tell you, when these leaves get fully big, they end up sometimes becoming emergency toilet paper in the woods. And look at their flowers. These flowers look almost like little tulips, but these flowers, like all the maples, will turn into those seeds that kids like to call helicopter seeds, samaras. Those are the seeds that come down fluttering in a spiral path. Striped maples make those seeds, as well as the sugar maples and the red maples too. You remember the poplars or the quaking aspen from my first video. Now you know why they call them tremuloides, Populus tremuloides. They quake in the wind, even the smallest breeze, even no wind will make these little leaves shake and rustle, and it's a sound that you hear at this time of year. It's one of those sounds that tells you spring is finally here fully. Here are the blossoms of a native plum tree, a wild plum. Although this is not growing in the forest, I've planted it here amongst my regular plum trees, the ones that make big fruit, like the commercial varieties that you find at the supermarket. I'm growing some of those here, but this native American plum, the wild plum, gives good pollen, and it helps to pollinate all my others. And you probably can hear the bumblebees buzzing around this tree. This flower makes such a wonderful smell. It is my favorite smell of all time, the smell of plum nectar, a plum blossom. But it's also really good food for all the bees and the pollinators. And there's bumblebees going to town up in this tree, eating all the pollen that they'll gather and the nectar too from the flowers. So these trees are very important and a wonderful, pleasant addition to all the flowers blooming now.
A friend of mine said that he and his wife would see beavers walking almost every evening near the Peachum Hollow Brook, so I decided to go check it out. And I definitely saw very recent signs of a skid road where the beavers would drag their recently cut logs. They even left some behind. Found lots of tracks, including this track, which was a beaver track with a duck and a coyote track over it. Busy place, I guess. I continued to follow the skid road, and I noticed that there were some very fresh pieces of wood lying along the ground. A little further down, I found a strange lodge, not with an underwater entrance, but perhaps this beaver was adapting to a different circumstance. Or maybe it was the home of something else, because I did find an otter track nearby. This beaver hind footprint looked remarkably fresh. Maybe I was getting close to finding the living beavers. And then I saw trees that were very recently cut. In fact, I felt like a trespasser. I felt like I had walked into a carpenter's workshop. Here was a tree that was so freshly cut it was still dripping with sap, and the shavings still smelled fresh. If you spend a lot of time around beaver habitats, you'll notice that they don't always finish cutting down their trees. I don't know why, but maybe they're working on this one little by little, or just saving it for a special occasion. Here was a log that had just been cut down but had not been fully scraped clean of bark, like a meal half eaten. This is what a log that a beaver has fully eaten looks like. You can see the marks of their rodent teeth that have scraped off almost every single piece of bark. And here is a yellow birch tree that must have been a frustrating fall because it couldn't reach all of the bark, just the part near the ground. They probably wish they had a crowbar. Then I discovered the beaver's plan. A fallen log across the Peachum Hollow Brook was serving as the anchor point for their new dam. Were they trying to block the entire stream? They had already succeeded in blocking several of the small tributaries, and I saw plenty of new material, meaning that they were still working on this project. I might seem obsessed with beavers, but I love them because they are so similar to people. It was only 2 million years ago that our pre-human ancestors started making stone tools. Could it be that in 2 million years, beavers will be building rockets and walking on the moon? Stay tuned to find out.